Chinatown 1974, it is heralded as the greatest screenplay ever written, an 11-time Oscar-nominated masterpiece that grossed $29 million and defined the neo-noir genre. In 1974, Chinatown made Faye Dunaway the untouchable queen of Hollywood, an icy, sophisticated blonde with the world at her feet. But behind the smoke-filled rooms and the haunting score lay a 100-day psychological war. This wasn't a film set. It was a predatory playground for Roman Polanski. To capture perfection, Polanski didn't just direct Dunaway. He systematically humiliated her, leading to a legendary on-set incident involving a cup of urine that Hollywood tried to bury for decades. While the world saw an artistic triumph, Faye Dunaway was being pushed to the brink of a nervous breakdown. Today we peel back the Chinatown myth to reveal the 100% uncovered timeline of Polanski's cruelty, the $29 million silence of Paramount, and the forbidden secret that branded Faye Dunaway difficult forever. By 1974, the industrial machinery of Paramount Pictures was operating at a fever pitch, fueled by a high-stakes gamble on a neo-noir masterpiece that promised to redefine the cinematic landscape. The film was Chinatown, and at its center sat the sovereign architect of the studio's prestige, Robert Evans. To the forensic observer of the studio era, this was the zenith of the sin wave, a moment of calculated opulence where the industry's most sophisticated assets were aligned to produce an immortal legend. Paramount had authorized a massive $6.5 million budget to resurrect 1930s Los Angeles, a sum that in today's currency represents an investment in the tens of millions. For Faye Dunaway, fresh off the explosive success of Bonnie and Clyde, this was the Oscar mirage, a professional coronation that appeared to be the absolute apex of her career. The environment surrounding the production was one of manufactured perfection and high-definition elegance. Richard Silbert, the legendary production designer, was commissioned to build a $6.5 million shell of deceptive beauty, a world of shadows and silk that functioned as the perfect containment unit for Dunaway's icy allure. To the public, Faye was the noir goddess, a woman whose market value was so high she seemed untouchable. Robert Evans, the man who viewed talent through a purely transactional lens, summarized her status as a high-yield investment. Faye Dunaway was the only woman who could bring that icy, lethal elegance to Chinatown. She was a gold mine. Every dollar spent on the perfectly tailored costumes and the atmospheric lighting was a move in a grand industrial design to turn Dunaway into a standardized icon of lethal femininity. Faye herself was blinded by the blinding flashbulbs of this deceptive peak. She believed she was participating in a collaborative sanctuary of high art, a sentiment she expressed during the early days of production with a visceral, hopeful clarity. I felt like I was finally at the center of the cinematic universe. Working with Polanski and Nicholson, it was the ultimate dream. She didn't yet realize that in the world of industrial cinema, a dream is often just a high-security cage. Her co-star Jack Nicholson, the reigning king of the decade's counterculture cool, sensed the immense gravity of the project. He observed the aura Dunaway brought to the set, noting the professional consensus of the time. Faye had this aura. On day one, we all thought we were making the greatest movie of all time. The critical establishment acted as the intellectual lubrication for this massive $6.5 million hype machine. The Hollywood Reporter echoed the industry's collective breathlessness in 1974, stating that Chinatown isn't just a movie, it's a coronation for Dunaway. She was being prepared for a royal ascent, her likeness being pre-sold to the masses as a symbol of power and mystery. Even the director Roman Polanski understood the utility of her specific vulnerability, though he viewed it with a much colder, more investigative gaze. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a specimen that fit his precise biological requirements for trauma. Polanski noted, "I needed a woman who looked like she held a dark secret. Faye was that woman." However, beneath the $6.5 million facade, the sin wave was already reaching its breaking point. The studio saw a goddess, but the director saw a laboratory rat. The prestige, the gowns, and the million-dollar marketing campaign were simply the high-art curtains being drawn over a theater of impending psychological stalking. Faye believed the $6.5 million budget was an investment in her talent. She didn't realize it was the cost of her own professional incarceration. As the cameras began to roll on the streets of Los Angeles, the goddess was about to be liquidated for the sake of the master's vision. The illusion was total. The budget was banked, and the industry was counting the projected receipts for a coronation. Tippi Hedren had her birds, and now Faye Dunaway had her director. The sin wave was poised for a terminal freefall, and the noir goddess was about to find out that in Hollywood, a dark secret is often a life sentence in disguise. The mirage was beautiful, but the desert of reality was just beyond the frame. But the radiant coronation at Paramount's high-security lot quickly dissolved under the blistering, unforgiving heat of the 1974 Los Angeles summer. As the first canisters of Chinatown were processed, the forensic reality of the production began to bleed through the celluloid, transforming Faye Dunaway's Oscar mirage into a terrifying psychological incarceration. Under the scorching California sun, the palm-lined streets of the set were no longer a backdrop for a cinematic masterpiece. They had become the boundaries of a torture chamber operated by a visionary tyrant. Roman Polanski was no longer merely directing a film. He was a surgical architect of humiliation, a man who believed that to harvest high art realism, he had to first liquidate the human dignity of his lead actress. The sin wave of Faye's life began a terminal high-velocity freefall from the heights of a goddess to the visceral reality of a laboratory specimen. The first anatomical rupture occurred during a sequence that demanded absolute visual perfection. In a moment of obsessive clinical focus, Polanski noticed a single strand of Dunaway's hair was out of place, catching the light in a way that disrupted his meticulously engineered composition. Rather than summoning a hairstylist or pausing the production, Polanski stepped directly into the actress's personal space and violently plucked the hair from her scalp. This wasn't a professional correction. It was a physical assault performed in front of a silent, paralyzed crew. One crew member who witnessed the extraction later provided a haunting investigative account of the shock. "I saw him pluck a hair right out of her head during a take. The scream she let out was pure pain." To the director, the physical personhood of his star was merely a negligible production overhead, an object to be pruned by force. The atmosphere on the set of Chinatown rapidly curdled into a regime of toxic control. Polanski didn't just direct, he hunted. He frequently subjected Dunaway to verbal vitriol in front of the entire equipe, a deliberate strategy of professional dehumanization designed to break her will and convert an S-class icon into a submissive puppet. The assistant director, caught between the director's sovereign power and the lead actress's obvious suffering, became a witness to a crime of silence. He watched a woman being pushed to the limits of her biological endurance, yet he remained frozen the machinery of the studio, ensuring that the master's predatory whims went unchallenged. Polanski's own assessment of his methodology remained chillingly detached, later remarking with cold pride, "She was difficult from the start. I had to use extreme measures to get what I wanted." The sin wave hit the floor of human dignity during a grueling hours-long interrogation sequence. In what has become the most infamous whispered legend in Hollywood's dark archives, Dunaway, in a state of total physical exhaustion, requested a basic biological necessity, a bathroom break. Polanski's response was a clinical denial of her human rights. He refused to pause the cameras, asserting an absolute dominance over her very biology. In the forensic history of this set, this was the moment the noir goddess was reduced to something less than an animal. The tension reached a lethal breaking point when Dunaway, cornered by a man who viewed her as a depreciating asset, reportedly fought back in the only way she had left. The urine legend whispered for 50 years in the corridors of Paramount suggests she threw a cup of fluid at Polanski's face, a desperate visceral reaction to a 100-day war of attrition. As the set lore goes, she reached her breaking point. After hours of being denied a bathroom break, she fought back in the only way she had left. Jack Nicholson, the only man on set with the cultural capital to witness the liquidation of his co-star without being destroyed himself, observed the wreckage with a growing sense of professional horror. He watched as the industry's most sophisticated actress was called a difficult prima donna simply for demanding the right to be treated as a human being. Nicholson later provided a grim retrospective of the atmospheric violence. Roman was pushing her in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. It was a 100-day war. The $6.5 million budget was no longer an investment in a film. It was the funding for a psychological siege. To the studio executives, the visceral reality of a woman's collapse was irrelevant as long as the footage captured a haunted quality that would sell tickets. The corporeal reality of this period was a masterclass in industrial negligence. Dunaway was subjected to a regime of psychological stalking where Polanski would stare at her for hours in total silence, a tactic designed to trigger a state of permanent dissociation. He wanted her to feel the weight of his gaze in every corner of the studio, ensuring she understood that she was no longer a person, she was property. Dunaway later summarized the destruction of her spirit with a surgical finality. "He was a tyrant. It wasn't about the performance anymore. It was about how much he could break me." As the production groped toward its conclusion, the industry continued to applaud the unfiltered truth of the daily rushes. They saw a noir miracle, but they failed to acknowledge the corporeal sacrifice behind every frame. Hitchcock had his birds, and now Polanski had Faye Dunaway, another blonde, to be professionally dismantled for the silver screen. The sin wave was at its lowest point. The coronation had been exposed as a heist, and the noir goddess had been converted into prey. The receipts of this billion-dollar legacy were being paid in the psychological currency of a woman's ruined peace. The 100-day war was nearing its end, but the real robbery, the theft of her future, was only just beginning, sealed in a canister of film that would forever bear the glint of a real, unsimulated tear. The lights were dimmed in the high-security screening rooms of Paramount Pictures, but the atmosphere remained radioactive, with the whispered reports of a production spiraling into madness. As the visceral footage of Chinatown began to materialize on the editor's monitors, a cold industrial consensus was forming within the boardroom. The director's predatory methods were yielding a masterpiece, and therefore the lead actress's psychological liquidation was a price the studio was more than willing to pay. This was the era of standardized complicity, where the sovereign power of the auteur was protected by a $29 million shield of silence. The sin wave of Faye Dunaway's career was being held in a terminal valley of isolation, as the men who controlled the industry's purse strings decided that a billion-dollar legacy justified a 100-day siege on a woman's soul. At the center of this corporate quarantine was Robert Evans, the golden boy of Paramount, who viewed talent through the clinical lens of an insurance adjuster. Evans was fully aware of the urine incident and the physical assaults on the set, but his private memos to the production staff revealed the cold-blooded priorities of the studio system. One high-level Paramount memo stated with chilling clarity, "The footage is genius. Ignore the complaints from the set. Just get the movie finished." To the boardroom, Faye's screams were merely white noise. The only frequency they tuned into was the projected frequency of the box office. Evans later admitted to this predatory pragmatism, confessing with a shrug of professional detachment, "We knew Polanski was a monster, but he was our monster. He delivered the hits." This systemic abandonment was further cemented by the standardized silence of Jack Nicholson. As the reigning S-class icon of the decade, Nicholson possessed the cultural capital to intervene, yet he chose a path of professional self-preservation. In the forensic analysis of the set's power dynamics, Nicholson's silence functioned as a social lubricant for Polanski's cruelty. He watched as his co-star was dismantled, but he remained within the safe confines of his own character, shielding his own market value from the radioactive fallout of the director's temper. Nicholson's own retrospective on the era was a haunting admission of this collective hunker-down. "I didn't want to get involved. I had my own role to worry about. We all just wanted to survive Roman." The industry's most powerful male lead had essentially signaled that the actress was on her own in the tiger's cage. The isolation of Faye Dunaway was total. She was a woman trapped between a director who hunted her and a studio that viewed her as a depreciating asset. She later summarized this corporeal betrayal with a surgical, unyielding fury. "No one came to my defense, not the studio, not my co-star. I was alone in that nightmare." The industry had successfully created a vacuum of accountability. While Jerry Goldsmith, the legendary composer, began to craft the film's haunting atmospheric score, the music functioned as a sonic veil. Goldsmith's melancholic trumpet solos were designed to evoke a sense of noir mystery, but in the forensic reality of the production, they served to drown out the visceral echoes of the set's abuse. The auditory brilliance of the film was a high-art cover-up for a 100-day crime scene. Financially, the liquidation of Faye's personhood was a masterclass in industrial inequity. While Chinatown eventually generated a staggering $29 million in global revenue, securing its place in the pantheon of cinema, Faye Dunaway's individual compensation was a mere fraction of Nicholson's. But the true dollars of the betrayal were found in the difficult label that was preemptively attached to her name. A studio lawyer from the era later provided the investigative conclusion to this strategy. A masterpiece justifies the means. That was the unwritten rule of the 70s. The studio didn't just bank the $29 million. They ensured that if Faye ever spoke out about the visceral reality of the production, her words would be dismissed as the ravings of an unstable prima donna. They had professionally incarcerated her reputation to protect the director's genius brand. The sin wave had reached a stagnant terminal plateau where the victim was being buried under the weight of her own success. The industry watched as the noir goddess was turned into a pariah, while the men behind the masterpiece prepared for their Academy Award coronation. The visceral reality was that the $29 million legacy was built on a foundation of non-consensual trauma and systemic abandonment. Every frame of the film that the critics called haunting was a forensic capture of a woman being erased in real time. As the production gropped toward the finish line, the machinery of the studio ensured that the forbidden secret remained sealed within the canister. The studio executives were satisfied the composer had masked the screams with melody, and the co-star had successfully navigated the fallout. Only Faye Dunaway was left with the receipts of the 100-day war, her market value decimated by a whisper campaign that she was hard to handle. The coronation was ready, the $29 million miracle was secure, but the real robbery had already been completed, the theft of a woman's future by a system that traded her peace for a box office hit. At Faded Glories, we remember the cost because the genius of Chinatown was a cold-blooded heist of a woman's dignity, and the silence of those who watched was the ultimate betrayal. The silver canisters of Chinatown were eventually archived in the temperature-controlled vaults of cinematic history, but the visceral reality of its production remained a living poison in the veins of its leading lady. As the decades of the 1980s and 90s unfolded, the film transitioned from a box office miracle into a sacred monument of the medium, securing 11 Academy Award nominations and anchoring Roman Polanski's status as an untouchable deity of the silver screen. Yet, in the forensic reconstruction of the era's power dynamics, the triumph of the film was the exact mechanism used for the professional execution of Faye Dunaway. The industry had successfully harvested her brilliance to build an empire and then systematically liquidated her reputation to ensure she could never testify against the architects of her trauma. The methodology of this career-long execution was rooted in the difficult label, a standardized branding strategy designed to act as a permanent career shackle. Following the 100-day war on the Los Angeles set, Polanski initiated a high-velocity whisper campaign that rebranded Dunaway's survival instincts as instability and madness. He weaponized her demand for basic human dignity, converting her refusal to be a silent puppet into a narrative of unmanageability. The industry, ever protective of its most profitable predators, accepted this narrative without a forensic audit. As actor Anson Williams later observed with chilling investigative clarity, Hollywood used Faye to make a masterpiece and then branded her difficult to cover up Polanski's abuse. The victim was not just silenced, she was rendered unemployable by a billion-dollar machine that valued the master over the human asset. The disparity of fate between the director and the actress represents the most staggering failure of justice in the history of the studio system. In 1977, Roman Polanski fled the United States to avoid sentencing for the sexual assault of a minor, becoming a fugitive from the very laws he had bypassed on the Chinatown set. However, the global cinematic elite, including the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, continued to protect his legacy, granting him a standing ovation and an Oscar for The Pianist decades later. While The Predator remained a celebrated icon of high art, Faye Dunaway was left to navigate a professional wasteland. She was trapped in the difficult cage her market value, decimated by the stories Polanski had told to protect himself. The director's assessment of his own cruelty remained unyielding and cold. "I never apologized. Why should I look at the result?" The psychological tears of this period were found in the totalizing effect of this smear campaign. The difficult brand was so effective that even other legends of the Golden Age began to participate in her social quarantine. Bette Davis, a woman who had fought her own battles against the studio system, was famously turned against Dunaway, declaring in a televised interview that she was the most difficult person I ever worked with. This was the ultimate victory for Polanski's propaganda. He had successfully engineered a world where even his peers acted as the executors of his vendetta. Dunaway later reflected on the crushing weight of this billionaire-dollar lie, stating with a haunted clinical perspective, "That movie followed me everywhere. It gave me fame, but it took away my voice." Financially, the liquidation of her career resulted in the loss of tens of millions of dollars in potential earnings. During her prime years in the 80s and 90s, when her market value should have been at an all-time high, her name was a standardized liability. Studios used the Chinatown rumors as a justification to offer lower paychecks or to bypass her entirely for younger, more compliant assets. The industry had essentially performed a preemptive strike on her future. While the film continued to generate massive revenue for Paramount and the estates of its producers, the woman whose face defined the noir goddess was paying a life sentence for a crime she didn't commit. The 11 Oscar nominations were the receipt for a robbery of a woman's personhood. Modern critics and investigative historians have only recently begun to perform the autopsy on this systemic betrayal. With the emergence of cultural reckonings, the forbidden secret of the Chinatown set is being re-identified as a case study in industrial predatory behavior. The difficult label is finally being exposed for what it was, a high-security containment unit for a woman who dared to say no to a director's biological demands. The real tragedy of the production was not the corruption of the water supply in 1930s Los Angeles. It was the raw biological truth of a woman being dismantled for the sake of a masterpiece. As the sin wave of this investigation reaches its terminal plateau, we are left with the cold accounting of a stolen legacy. The faded glory of Faye Dunaway is the living evidence of a system that views women as depreciating assets to be discarded once their utility is exhausted. She survived the 100-day war, she survived the hair plucking, and she survived the difficult label, but the cost was her entire professional trajectory. In the final investigative thought that haunts the corridors of Paramount and the halls of the Academy, in Chinatown, the real tragedy wasn't the mystery of the water, it was the psychological murder of Faye Dunaway for the sake of 11 Oscar nominations. The secret is out, the archives are audited, and the truth of the $29 million silence has finally met the unyielding light of history. Faye Dunaway's voice was stolen for 40 years, but as the faded glory of the era is reevaluated, her survival stands as the ultimate indictment of the god of cinema. Indictment of the god of cinema. Indictment